Just going to hop back. Yeah, there we go. You've got the right screen there. So 94.8%. Before I introduce myself in the session, I want to start off with this number, 94.8%. What do you think this refers to when talking about accessibility? 94.8% is the number of home pages that have one or more accessibility barrier. That's an accessibility barrier that could cause frustration, or it could be entirely preventative for someone being able to act independently. It's a barrier that could stop someone from being able to find out about their next gig, to book a ticket, to find out whether or not their access needs will be met at your venues. This is from the Web Accessibility in Mind annual survey of 1 million homepages, which they conduct each year. But as this is only automated testing, it's likely that this number is actually higher. And 94.8% already sounds like a pretty high number and quite a daunting number, and it is. But that's not to say that it's impossible or very difficult even to bring this right down for your own websites with a few simple changes. If you were to imagine if out of all the websites you visited every single day, only 5% of them worked for you in the way you needed them to, that's a huge amount of frustration that you'd be experiencing on a daily basis. And as I say, there are so many small changes that we can make to improve the accessibility of our digital content for everyone. And we'll talk through some of those today. So I'm Caspian. I'm a digital accessibility specialist and founder of Accessible by Design. And we are a digital accessibility consultancy. We work with arts and cultural organizations in Europe and North America. We're members of the World Wide Web Consortium, and part of the Web Accessibility Initiative working group, and I'm accredited by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals as a web accessibility specialist. I'm a white man in my 30s with a bald head and a beard, which I just got trimmed just before this session, so hopefully it's looking very neat. I'm wearing a stripy shirt, and I'm talking to you from my office in North London. Today, we are going to talk about accessibility in the news. We'll talk a little bit about mission, vision, and values. We're going to talk about barriers to arts and culture and usability testing and the notion that there should be nothing about us without us. And then we've got a few slides around tools and testing resources that we'll share as well. If you've got questions as we go, feel free to pop those in the chat. It'd be great to hear who you are and where you're tuning in from. While I'm presenting, I can't see anything except my presenter view, so we'll come back to those questions at the end. But if you're anything like me, you might forget the question by the time we get to them. So please do feel free to pop those in the chat as we go. So accessibility in the news. Yesterday, it was announced that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines have now become an ISO standard. So if you're unfamiliar with ISO standards, this is from the International Organization of Standardization. And the idea being that this organization brings together global experts to agree on standardized ways of doing things. So making sure that processes or building things happens in a regulated or standardized way. And the good thing about this is that by making WCAG an ISO standard, it means that it can be more easily adopted and integrated around the world as a method of assessing and implementing accessibility online. So what we hope to see from this is elevated levels of accessibility everywhere. And we have seen that with some of the recent legislation, such as the European Accessibility Act and the Web Accessibility Directive for public sector bodies, which was enforced in 2020. We do see these new directives and changes like this starting to make an impact. As the WCAG or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is already referenced in a lot of disability equality legislation around the world. But as we heard from Kuhn in the introduction, legislation doesn't necessarily mean usable. It doesn't necessarily mean fully accessible. Legislation is there to protect people when they're being discriminated against. It shouldn't be our primary motivator for making things accessible. And this is possibly an example of that. So on screen at the moment is a screenshot from the whitehouse.gov website. And this was taken earlier this year, in late January. And while our politics around the world are quite polarized, I'm not here to talk about politics, but very happy to any other time. But I wanted to include this as priorities change with changing parties and changing leaders. But one thing remains the same. Almost 1 in 4 people have a permanent disability, and everyone benefits from accessibility. And in fact, despite the changing landscape, or the changing political landscape, and the changing levels of funding available, changing levels of support, some of the world's largest corporations like Apple and Bloomberg have reaffirmed their commitment to accessibility on the basis that it's good for business. On screen at the moment is an excerpt from the Global Economics of Disability report from last year, 2024. And it states that 1.6 billion people in the world currently have a disability, that more than $2.6 trillion is the total disposable income of disabled people in North America and Europe alone. In the USA, disabled people have a disposable income of $1.3 trillion, and the global disability market of disabled people and their families and friends is $18.3 trillion. So these are vast amounts of money. And I'm not here to tell you that it's all about money either, but I think if you're ever having an internal battle about justification of making things accessible, you can always come back to the fact that it actually impacts the bottom line. If you have a market of around 25% of the population that was previously unable to access your products, and you make your products accessible to that 25%, you're opening up potential sales by a quarter. So what does your mission statement say about inclusivity? When working in arts and culture, many organizations have a mission statement that is about welcoming people, about being open for everyone, about being inclusive and welcoming everyone. And I've got a few examples here. These aren't intended to call anyone out. If anyone in the room sees their own mission statement on screen, this is really, I wanted to call this out as a positive thing, because one of the reasons I love working with arts and cultural organizations is the fact that they're available for everyone, or at least the intent is there. So we've got, we celebrate creativity, openness, tolerance, and generosity. We aim to be inclusive places, both on-site and online, where diverse cultural, artistic, social, and political positions are welcome. We're focused on making sure all of that is available to anyone, no matter where you're from, how old you are, how much money you have, or what challenges you face. We want to ensure that creativity, inclusion, community, and enterprise are an essential part of. And then open up the arts. Not everyone will love everything, but we make sure there's something for everyone. And lastly, it's our mission to make theatre for everyone. So as I say, these are statements of intent. They're commitments to everyone in the communities that these organizations serve. And it's to say that they are open for everyone. And as many arts organizations are publicly subsidized or receive funding from funding bodies, it's important that we are making things available for the whole population that those organizations serve. And so moving on to talk about what we mean when talking about digital accessibility. Accessibility can be a very broad topic, but put simply, accessibility means that no one is excluded. On screen at the moment is a screenshot from Microsoft's inclusive design infographic, and it indicates permanent, temporary, and situational impairments to touch, sight, hearing, and speech. So a permanent impairment might be having only one arm, being blind, deaf, or non-verbal. A temporary impairment may be having an arm injury, having cataracts, having an ear infection or laryngitis. And then a situational impairment, such as a parent holding a baby in one arm may only be able to use one arm to perform tasks that normally use two, like sending a text on their phone or browsing a web page on their phone. If you are a distracted driver, or if you've got glare from sun on the road, you might have difficulty seeing far ahead, or you may become distracted from what's happening around you. And then situational, so a bartender in a loud, noisy bar becomes far more reliant on the digital displays to communicate the cost of drinks, or for the customer to make sure that what they've ordered is what they're expecting. And lastly, here it's a somewhat questionable infographic icon, but a Viking-esque person suggesting that having a heavy accent can be a situational barrier for people. And this could be both the person with the accent, so for things like controlling voice-controlled devices like Alexa or Google Assistants, or potentially the people listening as well. And as we've got captions here being generated here by PowerPoint, sometimes captions will miscaption some accents and not others as well. So another example of a barrier where we want to ensure that technology can catch up. So what is a barrier? Oxford Languages defines this as a circumstance or obstacle that keeps people or things apart, or prevents communication or progress. So barriers prevent independence, but barriers are created by the design decisions we make. So we can either be unintentionally exclusive and inadvertently exclude people from things, or we can be intentionally inclusive. I think it's very unlikely that people are being intentionally excluding their audiences, though there are some cases where you might have known exclusions. And the important thing is that that's an intentional exclusion rather than an unintended barrier that stops someone from being able to access. So what about barriers in the arts? There are financial barriers, physical barriers, barriers of perception, and digital barriers. We're going to focus largely on the digital barriers, including the fact that currently the average number of barriers on an arts organization's homepage of their website is 54. So that's 54 issues that could stop someone from getting to the next stage of their journey. That's 54 issues that could stop people from being able to book, to log in, to buy a ticket, to join as a member, and 54 things that essentially could be extremely frustrating for users. And some of these barriers will be obvious to the person that they're encountering a barrier, and others might be things that are totally missed because of how the design has impacted their user experience. Another example of a barrier could be access tickets requiring pre-registration without a system like the access card. So if as a disabled person, you have to re-register and declare your access requirements every time you book tickets for something, that's a barrier. If you're doing that in the middle of an on sale, you might miss out on the tickets that you were looking for. Again, it creates frustration and it creates a sense of othering, like Kuhn mentioned earlier. And then lastly here we've got, or the last two things, we've got tickets only being available through one mode of sale. So in some cases, you'll still visit a website and it says, for access tickets, contact this email address, or for access tickets, phone this telephone number and wait in a queue for 3 hours, which again might not be available to someone's senses. So if you're only offering one route of booking, some of the people looking to book might not be able to access the booking in that way. So again, it's causing people to not be able to act independently and creating a further sense of othering. And that's the same with things like customer service only being available by phone or only being available by email. Now I'm going to try and play a short video. So let me come back to Demio. I'm going to change my sharing window and also share the audio. So you should now see how that's. So a moment, nearly there. Share. Okay, so I'm going to play to you a short video here.
Quick one. We're not hearing any audio through.
Oh. Thanks, Matt. Let me try that again then. So, also share tab audio. Let's try that again.
To click this button.
How's that? Did you hear that?
Yeah, we'll hear that now.
Perfect. I'm just going to skip back a little bit and then we'll play that again.
7 October, Sat, 28 October, Other, Date, Button, Image, Killers of the Flower Moon, 1500 hours, Button, 1915, Button, Image, Mean Streets, 1805, Button, Image, Smoke Sauna Sisterhood, 1600 hours, Button, Image, Zoo Motherhood, 2035, Button, 2030, Allocated Seating, 2035, Button. You are currently in web content. To exit this web area, press Control, Option, Shift, Up arrow. Button, Banner. Button. Sign up, button, main, login, button, adult, and 2 more items, add, button, concession, and 2 more items, group. You are, add, button. You are currently on a button. To click this button, add, button, add, button. You are currently on a button. To click this button, button. You button. You are currently on a concession, add, Rios, add, pick seats, button. You are currently on a main, inside web content, seat legend, button, main. Zoom in, button, next, button. You are button, banner, button, seat legend, zoom in, next, button, button. You are current button, end of banner, main, image, available image, select image, unavailable image, A1, image. You are A2, image, 8, image, 8, image.
Okay. So normally when we're presenting this in person, I would then be looking at a room full of somewhat bewildered people. So I'd really invite you to let me know what you think's happened here. I think sometimes because we've got both the visual and the audio output here, it's a little bit easier to decipher than for a fully blind screen reader user. I think many people would have not been able to get through and book a ticket in that example. So what we had here, I'm just going to switch back to my slides, was so here, as we were listening to that experience, was trying to book a cinema ticket. And in many cases, we heard the word button, but we didn't hear what that button controlled. We also heard many instances of images, but we weren't sure what was included within the images. So this is hopefully demonstrating how frustrating an experience can be when we have things like unlabeled buttons and unlabeled images within a booking process. Now, I'm currently working on a project where we've taken around 1,000 arts and cultural organisations' websites in the UK, and we've run this through an accessibility scanner. And this is going to give us a kind of outline of the state of accessibility in the UK. And I'd welcome other websites to join as well from Europe and North America, but I've taken the data sets of the Charity Commission and Arts Council funded organisations and been analysing this. I don't have that data set here available today, but very happy to share it with people following the session. But what I've got on screen at the moment is a breakdown of some of the most common accessibility barriers that people encounter on home pages. And this again is from the Web Accessibility in Mind 1 million study. So we've got one of the most common issues is a low contrast of text. So this is the difference between the text, the font color, and the background color. One of the worst offenders that we come across in audits for low contrast text is the unsubscribe link in emails. And I almost guarantee that every single person on this webinar today will have received at least one email where unsubscribe is written in grey text on a grey background. And this is a slightly devious design pattern to try and make it harder for people to unsubscribe. But in many cases, the low contrast will not be intentional. It might just be that the design hasn't been put through rigorous enough quality assurance testing. Then 55% of the websites had missing alt text. So alt text is the text that appears in place of an image when it can't be loaded for some reason. So for a screen reader user, they hear that alt text description. And if you're on a corporate network, sometimes that text will be loaded instead of the image itself. 55% of websites had missing alt text, and this is a very easy thing to manage as long as it's built into part of your everyday processes. We've spoken already today about the fact that accessibility is something that's an ongoing consideration. And so building in these rules into your style guides and your content authoring processes should help make accessibility part of your existing workflows rather than having to be an add-on or an extra consideration, just something that's done as standard. Missing labels. So as we heard some examples of in the audio output from the screen reader booking tickets there, we had some missing labels for buttons or empty buttons and empty links. So in these cases, some screen reader software packages will try and fill in the gaps and some won't be able to. Additionally, this isn't only impacting screen reader users, but it also impacts speech-to-text software users. So some users with low mobility and some users who are neurodivergent may use speech-to-text software to control their device. So they might navigate web pages saying, click and describing the link that they can read the label for on the screen. But if there's not a matching programmatic name to the visible label, it can result in a very frustrating experience for people. And then the last one here is missing language. So for many arts and cultural organizations, they'll be presenting artworks in multiple languages. And because of this, we need to use something called a language attribute to be able to determine which language pieces of content should be read in. And that could include things like the title of the piece. So for instance, if you are an opera house and you're presenting Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, to get the correct pronunciation, we need to have a language attribute of DE for Deutschland. But we're not here to talk purely about technical considerations. We're not here to talk purely about legislative considerations. We're also here to talk about users and people, because accessibility is primarily about people and making sure that we're meeting people's needs. And one of the things that we do when we're trying to design experiences, naturally we consider, what would I do in this situation? But it's always worth reminding ourselves that you are not the user, or I am not the user. It's probably a phrase you've heard before, but it's so easy to project your own behaviors on your design and development work, to take bias from our own experiences, and to assume that if we do things a certain way, others will as well. This is known as the false consensus effect. And I'm partly quoting from an article here from Norman Nielsen Group, who are a great organization who many of you may be familiar with. In this article, Raluca details that the false consensus effect was first defined in 1977 by Ross, Green, and House. And they define the false consensus effect as referring to people's tendencies to assume that others share their beliefs and will behave in a similar way in a given context. Only people who are very different from them would make different choices. And Ross, Green, and House showed that unlike scientists, layperson, or that is unqualified psychologists, or all of us who are put in the position of guessing how others would behave, we tend to overestimate how many people share choices, values, and judgments. And we perceive alternate responses as rare, outliers, or deviant, or more revealing of the responders themselves. When we generalize based on the examples available, it's called the availability bias, and it's a type of cognitive bias. Other types of cognitive bias include negativity bias, loss aversion, narrative bias, and framing, and it's often a source of stereotypes and overgeneralizations. So on screen at the moment is a screenshot of the book cover of Invisible Women, and this is a book called Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Criado Perez. And in Caroline Criado Perez's book, she reveals that while men are more likely to be involved in car crashes, when a woman is involved, they're 47% more likely to be seriously injured, 71% more likely to be moderately injured, and 17% more likely to die. And this is all down to how cars have been designed and tested, which is absurd. It's crazy, because aren't cars crash tested? There are lots of tests that take place to try and ensure the safety of people if they do unfortunately have a crash. But the crash test dummies that are used were first introduced in the 1950s, and for decades they were based around the 50th percentile male. And the most commonly used dummy is 1.77 meters tall and weighs 76 kilos, which was significantly taller and heavier than the average woman. And also the dummies had male mass proportions and a male spinal column. So despite researchers arguing for the inclusion of a 50th percentile female dummy in the 1980s, it wasn't until 2011 that the US started using a female crash test dummy. So biases and the false consensus effect result in exclusionary design. Now you might be thinking, I'm here to talk about digital accessibility. What does this have to do with my website? If we come back to the infographic from Microsoft here with permanent, temporary, and situational impairments to touch, sight, hearing, and speech, we need to consider the needs of users with a diverse range of needs. Unless we include everyone within our user testing, within our design process, within our discovery process, and when building the software and technology we use on a day-to-day basis, then we're applying availability bias to our work every day. And so how can we do this? We need to conduct inclusive usability studies. So going beyond, does it work? Can it work with assistive technologies for neurodivergent users? Does it meet all of the 86 success criteria that form part of the WCAG version 2.2 AAA? This will tell you, yes, it can work, but how well does it work? Now, determining how well it can work and making sure we're meeting the needs of a diverse range of users can be better established through conducting inclusive usability studies. So we need to make sure that we've got users that are representative of the population with a diverse range of needs, including blind and visually impaired users, deaf and hard of hearing, neurodivergent and physically disabled audiences and visitors. And as Martin said earlier, while two people may have the same disability, their needs may differ greatly from one another. The way that they navigate a website might differ greatly from one another. Some users will use both a visual display and an audio-based screen reader. Others may use magnification software. Others may use an audio-based screen reader and a refreshable braille display. Excuse me, and assistive input devices, all of which can be highly configured to an individual's preferences. So we want to think about planning usability studies, and these can be short tests. We use the speak aloud method, where we invite people to complete the tasks on a website that people would typically come to your website to do. So that might be buying a ticket, registering for email, buying a membership, finding out whether or not their access needs will be met when they get to the venue. So if we think about usability studies, these are things that you can do yourselves with. If you have an access focus group, you can perform these quite easily and at low cost, making sure that you're compensating people for their time. But ultimately, we can start with making a plan. What do we want to find out? Are we simply validating that it's possible to book tickets? If you are a screen reader user, if you're using speech to text software, what do you want to find out? We need to consider research ethics. So give people the time to understand how their data would be used, invite people and provide a kind of disclaimer for taking part in the usability study. Who's going to see the recordings of these sessions? How long will their data be held for? Do people actually need to see the recordings, or can you write up a summary report for your developers or internal teams to make updates accordingly? We need to recruit participants, ensuring that they're representative of people with a diverse range of access needs. And we need to consider the location and format. Since the pandemic, in fact, usability testing is probably quite a lot easier because people are so familiar with using Teams and Zoom, and their setups are so personalized that it means that you can invite people to a Zoom call. They'll be using technology that's familiar to them, not having to reset all of the settings when joining a call. And that means your insights are going to be more based on the website themselves rather than the technology that's being used. For example, if as a screen reader user, I've changed settings around the language, the verbosity, whether or not I have punctuation enabled, how quickly the screen reader is reading. If I go into a usability testing lab and all of the settings are different, I might be distracted about whether it's the website that I'm feeding back on or the technology I'm using to access that website. So by allowing people to use their own setups, we get better insights. We need to think about scenarios and tasks. So I mentioned earlier about booking tickets or signing up to a membership or mailing list. The important thing when testing is not to try and overload your tests with too many tasks in one study. We work with some non-verbal participants, and one person in particular, when we first sent a study out early on in our user testing, they spent 2 days trying to complete the tasks, for which people who joined the Zoom call spent 1 hour. So for non-verbal participants, we send a list of instructions to carry out the testing in an unmoderated way, asking people to type their feedback. But obviously that was far too long, so we need to make sure we're setting relevant constraints that people don't give too much of their time. And as I mentioned, we need to pay people for their time. So typically we pay £50 for a usability testing session of 1 hour. And then following that, we need to record and document. So ideally, you'll have more than one person on a call. You can review what's happening while the moderator can focus on asking follow-up questions, because often it's not necessarily what people are telling you is the issue that they're encountering. It can be something that they're not telling you, something they haven't spotted. And we want to try and kind of gather as much insight from people's experiences as possible by observing how they navigate a page. One important thing is to consider how you recruit participants. Think about how many people I test with. I would argue any testing is better than no testing, but if you have a lower number of participants, then it might be that you've got further analysis to do afterwards, because you don't want to make sweeping changes based on one individual's preference, particularly if you've not tested with a selection of users using the same technology, only with different settings. So we typically advise for a focused study to have a minimum of 5 to 8 participants, which is a recommendation of a usability testing expert called Jeff Rubin. You can identify around 80% of usability issues with 5 to 8 people, and the remaining 20% becomes far more costly in terms of time and budget. Great. I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to just skip through some of our testing tools before finishing up for any questions. But if you want to assess your own content and your own websites, as accessibility is something to consider throughout the design, the development, and the content, crucially. There are so many different readability tools you can use. We're on screen are screenshots of 2, Hemingway and Grammarly. There's also readable WebFX. Many of these are free and paid for versions you can use. They check for things like passive voice. They can make your writing sound a little robotic if you do everything that they say, so I would use with caution, but it can be very helpful to assist in writing. Tools like Axe DevTools and SortSite can be run either as an in-page scanner or across your full web domain, so the URL, and it will find things like color contrast issues that are insufficient. If you've got headings that don't follow a hierarchical order, it will find things like buttons without labels and images that have no alt text. So those are a couple of really useful tools. Again, Axe has a free and paid for version. SortSite has a free trial and then a monthly fee. There are a whole load of others available on the W3C website. Headings Map, a really quick and easy way to get a visual presentation of the heading structure of your page. So making sure that they follow a logical order, that you're not skipping heading levels. And then contrast checkers, so checking your text has a sufficient foreground and background color. There are 3 success criteria that relate to contrast, and this checker from Web Accessibility in Mind will tell you for each of those 3 success criteria whether the combination passes or fails. But even better than that, sorry, the link on this is wrong. I'll share the correct link, but there's a tool called Contrast Grid where you can input every color within your brand identity, and it will check them all against one another in one go, so you can see which combinations of colors you can use. And lastly, this has the longest URL ever, but it's a step-by-step guide. So if you can't afford to, or you can't at this point in time work with an accessibility specialist, there's some really helpful guidance on the gov.uk website called Doing a Basic Accessibility Check if you cannot do a detailed one. The URL is in the slides, which will be shared. And with that, I'd like to finish with accessibility is everyone's responsibility, regardless of your role. If you're creating or sharing content, you're responsible for accessibility. Accessibility should be considered minimum viable product. So we shouldn't release new software releases or content that could exclude essentially 1 in 4 of the population. And lastly, accessibility is essential for some, but beneficial for everyone. An accessible website may prevent the 70% of disabled users who click away from inaccessible websites and in turn displace £17 billion each year. So that's 70% of people who wanted to spend money with one organization have gone and spent their money with another organization because their website let them. So accessibility is good for business, but also inherently more usable, better performant, and by having better structures and content, semantic headings and considered link text, accessibility actually also goes hand in hand with search engine optimization. So your website will be better indexed by Google, which then in turn means that if you more directly land on the content you're looking for, you might also require less data transfer. So then accessibility also has a positive impact on the carbon footprint of your website if you've structured your content correctly. But most importantly, accessibility removes exclusion and welcomes everyone. And that brings us to the end of the slides.
Thank you, Caspian. You can leave it on that end page there while we go through questions. I'm just going to share links for everyone to the Accessible by Design website and also to access the PDF version of Caspian's presentation today. So I'll just share those in the handout section. Please send in your questions, guys. I've got one to kick us off, Caspian. Firstly, I love that piece about the kind of crash test dummies. I think it really highlights the kind of biases and kind of presuppositions that we all kind of hold inherently, but kind of overlook quite easily. And there was one thing that you mentioned around linking accessibility with quality and quality assurance. And it's something I've been hearing more about. Is that kind of mindset about thinking about accessibility purely as quality control and quality assurance been a much better way to frame accessibility when people are trying to get budgets or buy-ins from leaders to implement more kind of accessible procedures and processes in their organizations?
That's quite an interesting one, because I think actually possibly not. I think quality control is so often missed over as a whole. I think if it wasn't, then accessibility might be better catered for. Yeah, so I think it should be considered a part of testing. It should be part of kind of quality assurance. And like I said at the end, it should be considered minimum viable product. So if you, as an organization, have a definition of done, so what you determine is acceptance criteria for whatever you've built or whatever you're releasing, that should certainly include some accessibility criteria there. Because like we say, otherwise you're excluding potentially 25% of your possible market. I'm just going to take my headphones out, so hopefully then your next question will come up in the captions as well.
Okay. We haven't had any questions come in yet, but just another question from myself is one that I hear quite a lot, because digital accessibility encompasses so many things on people's websites, and often where's the best place for people to start when they're thinking about their accessibility journey or thinking about doing an audit?
So where's the best place for someone to start?
To start their accessibility journey and audit.
Yeah, I think with most things, the best place to start is taking stock of where you are at this moment. And you also need to consider kind of where you want to be, because it's not always the case that conducting a full audit of your full website is going to be the best use of time and resource. Auditing definitely serves a purpose for improving websites, particularly websites that you're keeping for a period of time. But I think if you are about to kind of start on a new website project, you can conduct a kind of minimal audit to see what your current website is like in terms of accessibility, to make sure you don't introduce those barriers into any new designs or updated platforms. And then consider kind of reviewing accessibility at every stage of that new project. So from discovery, thinking about the different user groups your website needs to serve, what their user needs are, through to design, making sure that your color contrast and visual identity don't present any barriers, and then through to the development of the website and the content, or the implementation of the platform and the content. one thing to consider is that sometimes these access barriers may be more kind of systemic in your organization. It might be that what appears to be a simple color change on your website is actually in physical signage throughout an organization. So while it seems quite simple, sometimes the changes can take time to implement in full. But we always recommend, if you can remove a barrier, don't wait for everything to be in place before doing so, because it's the difference between someone being able to access your organization or not. So yeah, I think in summary, take stock of where you are, where you want to be, and then that can help you inform the roadmap of what you need to do to get there.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. We have a couple of questions now, just marking this one from Christina. She asks, could you elaborate a bit more what the empty button and empty links mean in the video that you shared from when you're describing the common issues on homepages?
Absolutely. Yes. When it comes to empty buttons, we saw some examples of buttons saying things like book now or buy tickets. But I think what we heard audibly was just button. And so when using a screen reader, we would expect to hear the label of those buttons or what's presented visually alongside the type of content that it is. And so that would be usually a button or a link. A link should always take someone to a place, whether that be within the same page or another page, whereas a button should always trigger an action. And that might be opening a dialog window. It might be starting the stage of booking. So when they're unlabeled, it means we hear that they are links or that they are buttons, but we don't have any indication of what they control. And for a speech to text user, if the label is missing in the background, I could be reading out what's presented visibly, and then because there's a disconnect, it means that control's not going to be activated. So I might be saying, click book now, but because in the background, the label isn't programmatically associated correctly, I'm just essentially shouting into the void. There are other ways to work around that, but it takes more steps. And it also relies on the digital savviness of your users. So people will have different levels of experience with their own assistive technologies. Not everyone will know about every area of functionality within those, and so may not know what workarounds exist, and are very likely from our user testing simply to give up if something doesn't work.
There we go. A question from Naomi here. She asks, I'm really curious how you might balance having enough information on the website regarding access versus having too much information. For example, having documents in PDF format as well as Word, etc.
Yeah, this is a really good point. And I think if we go back to Martin's presentation, what was very nice about the platform that they have Nimbus on the access card is being able to surface the relevant information to the relevant people. I think when you know what you're looking for, you can refine your search. In usability testing that we've done in the past, we've looked at laying out access information in a couple of different ways. So by impairment type or by access provision. And some of the feedback we've had is that if someone has recently become blind, they may not know what access provisions exist. So they might be looking for content that says access for blind people. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to want to avoid certain language and terminology because people are worried about offending users and people. And so I have had sessions with organizations where they haven't wanted to use the word disabled or blind or visually impaired, or they don't know what language to use for what impairment type. But there are guidelines on the gov.uk website around kind of commonly used language around disability. And I think it's better to provide the information and group it in a way that's accessible to people, and then accept if someone writes to you and says, I don't like how you've laid this out, you can take that on as feedback in relation to any positive feedback you might be getting as well. Sorry, I realised you asked about different formats as well. So with PDF, we typically advise against using PDF as a standalone format. It's always best to have content in HTML where possible, because HTML is far more configurable than a PDF. There are more steps that have to be taken to make a PDF accessible. Often things like the reading order is incorrect in a PDF. A Word document is inherently more accessible. But I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and there was a session on Easy Read, and members of the community there mentioned that if there was an alternative format in Easy Read at the foot of a web page, they wouldn't bother scrolling down to get to it because they would be overwhelmed by the amount of text they had to wade through to get to it. So I think we need to think about where this information is surfaced and at what point in the user journey people need it, and be able to link people directly to it wherever possible. So yeah, I think I'd revert back to Martin's platform again there, trying to provide tailored and relevant information as easily as possible.
Great, thanks for that. Thanks for the question, Naomi. We've got one more here from Freya. I'll just mark it. She asks, what happens if you have a video on your website with BSL translation? How does that come across on a screen reader for a blind person?
So there are occasions where if you're providing an alternate format, that format doesn't necessarily need to meet the needs of all users if its primary purpose is to provide access provision for a specific user group. However, you can create videos that are more integrated in terms of access, so having both BSL interpretation alongside captions, alongside an audio reading or transcript. So for a blind or visually impaired screen reader user, if your video was silent and only had the BSL interpretation, the user would be able to tell that the video is playing, but unless it had closed captions on, they might not be able to engage with any of it. They might just know that there's a video with no audio available. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks for that, Caspian. That's all the questions we have so far, but don't let that stop anyone. Feel free to send in any questions at any time and we'll try to get them answered throughout today's session. We're now going to take a quick break. So thanks for the presentation, Caspian. Really insightful. So much packed in there. So I hope everyone enjoyed that.